Hi, everyone. Interestingly, my name is Patricia Odero. I work for Duke University based in Nairobi. I actually work in global health innovation. And one of the ventures we've worked with is Simprints in taking forward their technology in the health sector. But that's sort of what I'm going to talk about today. Today I'll be sharing with you the story of how crowdfunding, investment-based crowdfunding, has developed and is developing in Kenya. And maybe just to give you a prelude as to why I, as a doctor, am talking to you about crowdfunding. It's so one of the ventures that we work with, just about last year, mentioned to me, oh, hey, we're raising some, investment-based crowdfunding in the Netherlands. And I was like, oh, really? Okay, that's interesting. And a different venture I know that's a social enterprise that has developed Kenya's first athletic shoe said they're going back to Kickstarter to raise a second round of crowdfunding to launch a new product. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. What are the chances that two different Kenyan organizations would be raising crowdfunding? And I was like, okay, why is this happening? Because I hadn't really heard of that as a viable source of funding for enterprises. And so I'll talk to you a bit about, if the animation works, about Kenya. I am not sure. Okay. Oh, great. Yeah. That's a bit of Kenya. So if you are familiar with Kenya, you probably know safaris are great wildlife heritage. But this is another version of who we are, a rapidly growing emerging economy that's the home of innovations such as mobile money, M-Pesa. And so it's a country of contrast. We also are a country that has a youth unemployment rate of about 18%, where every year 3/4 of people basically who get jobs are absorbed in the informal sector, in small and medium enterprises. And the biggest hurdle that these small and medium enterprises face is a lack of capital. So generally people will start with, their savings, friends and family, but friends and family in Kenya only give you loans. They don't invest in your business. And they're short-term loans. And so what happens next? So you have this missing middle, and that's essentially the research context. So how has crowdfunding come to fill in this missing middle? And how has this evolved in the country? And so, according to a couple of, there's an actual Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, I think, based in this space. And according to, every year they do a benchmarking report. And over the last 4 years, crowdfunding has been growing in Africa. So in the US, those of us, I think, from the US, maybe you've heard of the Jobs Act. Jumpstart our startup businesses. So that's basically an act that was passed in 2012 by the Obama administration that basically cleared all of the regulatory barriers. Okay, well, not cleared all, but at least tried to reduce the regulatory barriers around crowdfunding. And so that was essentially trying to see how do you get small businesses to raise money through crowdfunding? Because if you're a banker, crowdfunding could also be a conduit for money laundering and other things. And so essentially, this particular piece of regulation really grew crowdfunding in the US, and the same thing in Western Europe. While in Kenya, however, this growth has been organic. And so that was, I think, one of the things that was quite interesting. So how has this sort of sector organically grown without enabling regulation, and a lot of the things that probably would be cited as factors in the global north? And so the particular piece of crowdfunding, so crowdfunding, for those of us who maybe might be aware of it on a high level, is actually divided into different variants. So there is donation-based crowdfunding, which is, I think, we're quite familiar with. And then there's reward-based crowdfunding. So what my friends were doing with their shoe, that if you pledge a certain amount, we'll give you a new shoe. If you pledge another level, you'll get a different type of reward. And then there's actually investment-based crowdfunding, which is either debt or equity, but raised from a crowd. And so that's what's been growing in Kenya. Essentially, this was a qualitative study, set out some research questions. And this was basically the theoretical lens I used was looking at Kenya's investment crowdfunding space as an emerging field. And so emerging fields essentially are characterized as fields or spaces where they are if you think of institutional work, fields could be, in terms of, they range in a spectrum of maturity from emerging to mature. So in emerging fields, the relationship between the actors is not quite clear, power dynamics are not yet established, and also often participants do not know that they have aligning interests or common interests, whether those interests confluence or diverge. And so this is really a very complex space, where the rules of the game are not quite clear. And so that's the theoretical lens through which I looked at Kenya's crowdfunding market. And so three findings emerged. Essentially, the main thing was that in order to grow, or in order for Kenya's crowdfunding market to grow, what was critical was building trust, and building trust across three levels. So at the micro level, where essentially it was really about lengthening your chains of trust, and I'll talk a bit about that. At the meso level, or what you'd call the ecosystem level, which was really about building new trust capital. And then at the micro level, where you have institutions essentially legitimizing crowdfunding and being able to be trust brokers, be the ones to say that we trust this, and so therefore you, the general public, should. And so at the meso level, I'm not sure what happened to a slide, so I'll tell you a bit about the micro level. So at the micro level, essentially what we found is that there was, let me see if it, okay, great, yeah, it's just a slide order thing. So, oh yeah, something I forgot to mention to you about. So we do have actually a culture of crowdfunding in Kenya. Has anyone heard of the word Harambee and not the gorilla that died? Okay, so Harambee is actually a way in which, as Kenyans, we collectively raise money for emergencies. So let's say someone is sick or has there's been a sudden death in the family. So we'll come together and donate. And so that's part of our culture, and it's been used also politically as a rallying call when we gained independence by our first president, in order to say, bring everything you have and help build the country. And so when we were talking to people, okay, so in this context, how does investment-based crowdfunding resonate in a country where you have sort of donation-based crowdfunding as the culture? And so they said, in a Harambee you give, but then you give with the hope that when it is your day, or when something bad happens to you, that then you will get that reciprocity. And so the tension is that you also have a market where the resources are scarce. And so how do you, as a funder or as an entrepreneur trying to raise investment crowdfunding, how do you build trust in a space where you're fighting for meager resources and where essentially you're not really, it may not always be a reciprocal thing? And so the issue was a lot of ventures that have been successful cited the fact that you had to give a personal touch, that you had to show people that it is you they were trusting and not your venture, it's not your product that was a great world-changing idea, but it is you, the fundraiser, that was actually, the source of trust. And so then at the meso level, let's go back. Yeah, and so at the meso level, at the ecosystem level, the challenge was that, at the personal level, you can only, I know you guys, maybe now you know me, you're like 100 people. But 100 people do not make a campaign or do not make an industry. And so how do you grow those levels of trust and build enough of trust capital in order to scale crowdfunding? And so some of the things that have been tried is approaching the diaspora, so Kenyans who live abroad. Also talking to people, so we have investment clubs called chamas, which are essentially groups of friends who come together, put together money. Initially, they started out as table banking, but have now evolved into some very sophisticated sort of investment vehicles. And so how do you get groups such as this, who may have the capital to develop trust in crowdfunding, to be able to use that as an investment vehicle? And so what's been happening is that there's been a lot of funders who have connections outside of Kenya, who are reaching out to connections in their diaspora, Kenyans who live abroad but who know the context, and recruiting them into crowdfunding. And also ventures that were able to share how they were able to lean into chamas their, investment clubs, their friends' investment clubs, host them over for tea and essentially convince this, informal clubs to invest in their crowdfunding campaign. Then the third area is, at the macro level. This was quite interesting. So one of the things is that, so in Kenya, we have what you call a relational financial repertoire. So I basically conduct business transactions with you based on the depth of our relationship. While in literature says that while in the West or in the global North, essentially it's institutions that, or systems and processes that make you trust a financial process. So if there's a strong regulator, if there is a very good banking laws and banking systems, then you're going to invest your money. In Kenya, that's not the issue. It's more if I have a good relationship with you, then I will make the investment. So, however, some of the findings were that in this context of investment-based crowdfunding, institutions played a really huge role. And so there was the partnerships between platforms, crowdfunding platforms, and institutional funders that would sometimes come and provide matching funding to bolster campaigns. So therefore, if the innovator or the entrepreneur raises a certain amount, then the institutional funder was going to match that fund. And that actually, made that campaign viable and also attracted funders. And then the second thing was that essentially the regulator and the industry association, which was quite an interesting partnership, collaborated. So usually regulators set the rules, but in this case, the African Crowdfunding Association has come up with what they call the ACFA label, which is essentially a license that regulators can sign on to and says this is a simplified set of rules that we, the regulators, say works. And we say that if a platform adheres to these rules or this label, then you're actually certified to conduct crowdfunding in our market. And so Kenya is one of the countries that the ACFA label is being tested. And that's quite interesting because usually industry associations defend themselves from regulators. And so those are the three levels of trust. And so finally, what's the relevance of this research? So three things. Essentially, the cultural context does influence the adoption of models. So crowdfunding is relatively established in the West, something quite new in Kenya. And so how crowdfunding is going to be institutionalized and grow in Kenya has to take into account how people relate in financial transactions, the quid pro quo, low institutional trust, etc. And also be able to see how do you leverage trusted individuals and trusted networks to be able to grow this, because that you cannot escape that. You cannot say that I will grow this industry based on a set of great regulations. And then finally, the issue around, flipping the script. So there's been like a couple of instances I've said that are unusual. So just considering that even as you take an established model into a new context, sometimes what works in one context may be completely reversed in another. And so the area of future research, I think, is really just how to institutionalize established models in non-Western contexts. We didn't find that much in the literature that says, good practices or, promising ways on how to do this. And so, especially to the cohort 4 team, we hope that this would be, built into your research. Thank you.